So if you're watching this online, what I'm doing here is I'm recording a talk to give at an online conference. It's the culture talk that I give. So I'm just going to give it kind of straight and chop this intro off for submitting it to the conference, but I'll upload it here and you can see a sample of what this talk is like. This is the 30-minute version of the talk. There's, a 45, 90-minute, there's a lot of content to go over, but I've kind of compressed things down. And, as always, if you want to see more things like this, I do twice a week, I do a show and I do all sorts of other little videos. If you go to tanzutalk.com, you can find the archives and all sorts of things like that. I try to broadcast on Tuesdays and Thursdays at 10:30 a.m. Amsterdam time. So with that, let me just kind of roll into here and we'll see what happens. Well, thanks for having me here. I want to go over a talk that sort of explains what it is we're driving towards when we talk about improving the way that we do software. The reason that we install Kubernetes and the reason that we're interested in application development and DevOps and product management, all these kinds of things. Not only sort of go over what the goal of that is, but more importantly, when it comes to especially large organizations, what that culture looks like, and also how you scale that culture in a large organization. So first of all, just a tiny bit about myself. I'm pretty lucky that I get to spend pretty much all of my time in a professional capacity studying how large organizations get better at software, how they transform from a project way of doing things to a product way, and interview people and talk with them and put them in book form, like you see here. Here's 2 books that you can get for free if you want to. You can go to cote.io/books. And I do a lot of podcasts and other things. You can look up plenty more about me if you're interested, but let's get on to the actual presentation here. Well, so in our industry, there's always a lot of talks about culture. I talk with a lot of management and executive people, and that's one of the top things they want to know about is, how do I change the culture of my organization? And what I found over the years is that in this conversation, in talks that people have about it, there is sort of this definite idea of what the end goal is. We want to have an innovative, creative, DevOpsy kind of culture. But there's really not that much talking about how to get there from where you are now to that kind of fully finished OWL. And over the years, I found it pretty unsatisfying to figure out exactly what that is. And so I've spent some time over the years researching it. And this is a brief overview of some of the things that I found and the way that I frame this notion of what culture is. The first thing is to ask this question, why do we care about culture? If we're in a large organization, we already have plenty of culture. Lots of stuff going on. We've got lots of software that we're working on. And in recent years, what companies and organizations are focusing on is, instead of just delivering a project way of doing software, a set of features, they're really thinking about how software is a storefront that they have, their primary way of interacting with their customers or with their internal employees. And what they found is that the more they can improve that customer experience, that user experience, it will allow them to improve and innovate their business. You hear a lot about people wanting to be like tech companies, and we're not a bank or a car company, we're a software company. And what they're expressing here is this idea that we can start using software as the primary sort of engine of how we do business. And getting to that, where you can be indeed like a tech company, you have this product way of thinking about software, is a lot of what people are driving at when they're talking about changing culture, right? They're not just talking about, installing VMs like we were in the 2000s, making something more efficient and easy to manage. They're talking about fundamentally changing the way they think about software, the way that they do software, so that software becomes really that expression of the business that they have and how their business functions, and then in an advanced way, allows them to innovate what their business does. Now, the problem when it comes to this is the way that we've been doing software thus far doesn't really match to this product way of doing things. But in organizations that are not tech companies, they tend to deliver software in a different way. And where they are at the moment, as you can see from these sad donuts, is they're not quite at that point where they can rely on software to be that core thing that runs their business. And one of the primary ways that I judge this, as you'll see, is the frequency that they release software. Because the more frequently you're releasing software, the more you're evolving it, and the more of a chance you get to discover what the market is, discover what customers are doing, and really evolve and innovate. So as you can see from surveys, there's many organizations don't really deploy improvements to their software very frequently, just about half, which is an astonishing amount. And what that means is that your software is static. Your software can't really be relied on to evolve and innovate your business. Now, you can see some other sad things, right? That a lot of organizations organizations are really stuck with what they call legacy apps, their existing application portfolio, their existing software, and just the inability to change it and evolve it is really holding them back from changing how they operate, from improving the way they do their software and changing what their business looks like. So many organizations are in this state, this land of sad donuts. And a lot of what this changing culture gets to is how do we get ourselves out of these sad donuts and get to some happy donuts? So let me give you an example of a happy donut. And that is from Daimler, the company that makes Mercedes and many other, they've got trucks and things like that. And there's a team there that has this culture that we're looking for, this culture of innovation. And they're in charge of a storefront for buying cars. You know, there's a search engine. You can go customize the car, kit it out however you want. They tell me that a lot of people, they go in and they build this ultimate sports car. And then like me, they end up getting realistic and configure a station wagon in the configurator. And depending on the geography you're in, you can schedule to go talk with a dealer, all sorts of things, right? So if you think about it from the standpoint of selling cars, this is a lot of the first interactions that you have with your customers. It's your storefront. So you would want the software you use to do that to be very good and to be evolving, to always be adapting to what customers want to do. So the team that was doing this, they have this very product mentality way of doing things. They noticed on their site, that's the front end for doing car searches, that a lot of people were searching for these Sprinter vans, which are not normally part of that line of business. This is what ice cream people will drive, or plumbers, things like that. Completely separate part of the business. So obviously, their software is done on their own and doesn't work with the people selling station wagons. Again, completely separate part of the business, right? So it sort of makes sense. But the team there, because they had this culture of innovation, they saw that people were interested in finding these vans. So they put a theory in place. They said, well, despite the fact this is a separate type of business, why don't we integrate the backend for the Sprinter vans and allow people to look at these vans, not just the sedans and cars that we have? So as we'll get into, having a team who even are curious enough to look for that kind of data and think about something to do is part of this culture and is valuable. But the tool that they use to pursue this, to pursue those theories and evolve the business to innovate, I think is equally valuable. Now, I call this loop the small batch loop. It's, nothing that I've come up with. It's like the lean startup loop. It's a design loop. It's even the scientific method if you think about it. But following this loop in this culture, this product way of doing culture is very important because it makes it more disciplined instead of just, creative and exploratory. And that is, in this example, there's a theory that people looking for station wagons, every now and then they'll look for a Sprinter, and there might be a reason why they want to find a van. So what kind of theory would we come up with that they're looking for a van and that they would buy one even if they're not an ice cream truck driver or a plumber? So in development, the way that we run an experiment is we write code, right? Like you have to write the code for it, and you put that code in front of a user. And then you somehow, this is the vital part, you somehow measure what's happened. Do people end up buying those vans? And if they do, then you've validated your theory and you've come up with a new innovation, a new feature. And going through this loop over and over again until you discover what works and you back it up with the rigor of measuring and looking at your assumptions of validating and invalidating things. That's really at the core of how I see these software teams that we're aspiring to be, these product teams, really explore what their software can do to help their business out. So lo and behold, as you might be guessing, what the team found when they integrated with the Sprinter backend is that there were many people like the Kinesis here who wanted to buy, even though they were consumers, right? They weren't professionals. They wanted to buy Sprinter vans to use for RVs or caravans or whatever you want to call them so that they could go on trips. Like many great examples, it seems ridiculously obvious in hindsight. But if you recall the situation that this was two separate lines of businesses that felt like they had no reason to integrate with each other. And until you had this kind of cultural of innovation playing out in a team, no one had really thought to merge the two together and explore the possibility that they could sell Sprinter vans in the same channel, the same way that they're selling these other cars. That there might actually be, in the view of us, the people buying this, like we don't care that they're separate lines of business. And so therefore, the way the software is managed and done is delivered should be merged together. And it's going through that small batch loop that you can discover this and also prove out that this is a good idea and a way of doing business. And then, as in this example, you get pretty much free revenue, right? Like this isn't something you just integrating systems together, which costs some money, but then long term, it's you don't have to create a brand new business. So that's kind of the end goal that you have, a description. And I'll give you a couple more examples here. But let's talk about, the way that we get to that end goal is we're putting in place this culture of innovation, as I like to call it, a product way of thinking about software. And as I was talking about earlier, I've always found it hard to kind of define what culture is. And, I started thinking about this when the DevOps reports started coming out, and they went over I think the Westrum way of thinking about things. And it's a good way of describing what a culture looks like, right? So you can kind of diagnose what kind of culture you're in. And, I will let you guess which ones are the undesirable ones. And so this is fine, right? But this is more like a state that something exists in, and it's kind of attributes that you have. And so I always wanted more than just this, right? Because this kind of describes what something looks like. And thankfully, back in the 90s, there were a whole lot of books back in the 90s written about changing the corporate culture, when another gigantic sort of notion of how organizations work was changing over. And so digging through those books and some other ones that are fun to look through, there's some references for you. There's some quotes from there to summarize the way that those books kind of looked at culture. What the ideas of what culture is boiled down to in a very tactical, pragmatic way for me is culture is how we do things around here, right? It's the processes that we have, the norms that we have, the sort of expectations. You can think of them as thought technologies or meatware. And so I think when we're talking about changing the culture and the type of culture that we want in an organization, we're really talking about how that organization functions and the mindsets that people have. Are you more command and control, like people wait to be told what they're doing and someone has to tell them what to do? Or is it more like that Sprinter example? So now let's focus on, in the area of software development and managing that whole software capability you have in your organization to be the main way that you're running your business. How would we do things around here in this kind of product-driven culture of innovation that we're shooting for? I want to go over what I think the individuals, as we would normally call them developers, but let's call it the product team, the developers, the product managers, the designer, the people who are working on the software. I want to go over what the attributes they have, how they do things. And then I'll go over, I think, maybe even more importantly, what management does, the context, the system that management sets up so that these teams can be successful. So first of all, these three things, there's other attributes, but these are three that I think are the most important, and they're all kind of the same thing. If you look at how people who are on teams like the Sprinter Van one think, how they do things around here, they're innovative, right? They want to come up with new ways of doing things. They want to apply that small batch loop to explore and come up and imagine up new ways of running their business, of what their software looks like. Now, to do that, they're comfortable with taking risk. They're risk takers, or if you prefer something safer, they like to learn, right? Learning is all about taking risks and failing. Like, I think about when my kids are learning to read and do math and other things, they're constantly failing at it, right? But because they're failing, they're learning and validating and invalidating things, and they're learning the way to go about doing things. They're taking risks, right? A reason why I'm bad at learning things is I don't want to take the risk of failing, so I just do the things I know over and over again. But people on this team will try out things. They'll go through that small batch loop, and they'll try out a new way of doing things, and if it doesn't work, they try out a different way of doing things. And then another attribute that they have is they're very people-centric. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean they need to be extroverts, but they think about a person is using this software. I move pixels around on the screen. A person is using this software. So I want to get into their head and kind of think about what that person's doing, what their motivations are, how I might help them out. I'm curious to observe what they're doing because I'm helping that person. So their focus is not on features that they're implementing or kind of like just doing their job. Their focus is on like, I want to make this person's interaction with my software, their time spent with the software better. So let's think about those attributes. Now, in order to have a team like that in place, right? A team of people who are allowed to use software to go through that small batch process, to innovate and be curious and explore. That's not, if you think about what's required for that, most software organizations are not set up that way. They're set up where the developers, first of all, they don't really necessarily have product managers or designers, right? So they're just developers who are told what to code. They might even be given wireframes, like code exactly this screen, right? So they're not really given the opportunity to explore and innovate. They don't really have those attributes. So management, or leaders, they need to change what they're doing. They need to rewrite the way that they are doing their system as well, their system of management. And I like to think about it, you can think about it as the context of the system they set up, but I like to think about it as what management gives these teams. So the first thing is that managers give these teams a huge degree of autonomy. You can think of this as ownership, right? So if you go to that Daimler example, they're giving that team ownership of that interaction, of this idea that we could add in the Sprinter vans, right? They have the autonomy to make a decision about what features should be in a software and what to do next. Now, this requires a huge degree of trust in the team. Management has to trust that the product teams, the developers, product managers, designers, that they care and they'll do a good job. Now, this is a huge, huge issue for most people in large organizations, to actually trust that people are doing things, which, takes some time to get there. And it's also, if you think about it, kind of a failure of management that if you have this organization and you don't trust it, you've done something poor. Now, the other thing is that the team needs to have voice. And again, these are three aspects of the same thing. And that voice is, because they have autonomy, because they're curious, they can voice that I think we should do this thing. I think we should pursue, even though it's a separate line of business, let's pursue showing Sprinter vans to people. So if you're in a management position, think about how these, and in addition to other things, are things that you need to do to set up your system, right? You want your developers to start doing their software differently. You need to think about how you're programming the meatware of your organization so that teams of people have this and they can start doing that more culture of innovation of doing things. Now, let me give you another example of what this ends up looking like. This is from a industrial kitchen management company, also food service. They deliver food and they'll run the kitchens for you. And this is, I think, a great example of all of those 6 attributes. So this organization, like all organizations that want to run things more efficiently, have better customer experience, you can outsource your kitchen, a campus or a business. And they were using paper recipes. So you'd have 3-ring binders full of like the recipes of how to cook pasta and stuff like that. And so the idea of management was that to be more efficient, to have more consistency in the recipes, and to have newer ones. Of course, what we need to do is digitize these recipes and put them on an iPad. So they got together a team of people, and thankfully it was one of these product-driven teams that had this kind of culture of innovation we're talking about here. And they, in a very command and control way, they said, go digitize these menus. So despite this, they gave the team autonomy and they trusted them in voice to do the following. The team, being people-centric, said, all right, well, why don't we go observe the people using this software and see what it is they're doing so that we can write the software to be most helpful for them. So the team got up at like 4 a.m. in the morning and they got to the kitchen at 5 or whatever. And for a week or so, they observed the people actually going about their duties. And what they discovered is that while the paper recipes were maybe not as good as great as they could be, an activity that took up a tremendous amount of time and task switching was measuring mayonnaise, measuring chicken, making sure that various ingredients were kept at a safe temperature, right? And so because they're people-centric, this team was curious and they wanted to take risks and be innovative. They used the voice that management gave them to say that we're not going to digitize the recipes just yet. We found something that we think is even more important and will make the kitchen run more efficiently. And so they went and digitized the temperature taking. They did some Internet of Things stuff and they kept more of a digital record of it instead of the piece of paper that tracks the temperatures. And indeed, this saved a tremendous amount of time for the kitchen staff. It made what they were doing more efficient because they had to spend less time on measuring the mayonnaise. And it also makes compliance, that is health inspections, a lot easier because you don't have all these sheets of paper that you have to keep track of. It's all computerized, right? And then eventually, the team went on to digitize the recipes onto iPads and so forth and so on. But overall, because the team had this culture of innovation, right? Because they had this product-centric culture in place and those 6 attributes were scurrying around there, the team was able to meet the original business goals, right? And even exceed what those business goals were because they discovered a whole other problem that originally management didn't want to solve. And those kind of results, that kind of discovery that really changes the way that you operate. To me, when we talk about digital transformation and, we're a software company, not a food supply company, that kind of mindset, it really gets down to that thing, using the small batch process, the software process to discover new ways to run your business, to optimize it, and really constantly be learning how you can make the way your organization functions better with software. So with that, we've got this idea of what a culture is and the kind of attributes that management puts in place to allow for the team there. I want to spend the rest of the time going over how you scale this kind of culture, right? I mean, this is the question. This is kind of what I've been interested in the last few years, because I talk with and work with primarily larger organizations. And their issue is that, we don't just have 3 or 4 teams over there in Stockholm who we can kind of just all go out to lunch together and kind of sync up and sort out how we're doing. But we have all, tens of thousands of people, thousands of projects, thousands of apps that we need to switch over. How do we hope to scale that kind of thing that's normally done in a kind of person-to-person way? So I want to go over some tools, mostly that management uses to help scale that kind of culture. And I think the first often underappreciated, underdone thing is to really look at something that normally is not very helpful at all. And that is your company's vision, right? Your vision, your values, your mission statements. And these are often very nice and aspirational, but they don't really tell those development teams what they should be doing, right? I mean, ask yourself, do I know what my company's vision is, the mission statement for my company? And if I had to decide, the next task I'm going to go do, does that actually inform how I'm going to do that decision? So I think this is a great example of a very pragmatic vision from DBS Bank in Singapore. And it really gets to this idea that every time you're making a decision about a feature that you're doing, even what Kubernetes distribution you might use, or if you would use one at all these kind of decisions. If you have any doubt or you need some way of guiding it, you can use this vision to determine if you're meeting that need of, I don't want our customers to have to spend too much time with our software, getting whatever they need from us. I want them to do it quickly because they need to get on with the rest of their life. So that's easy if you're in the app layer where you're moving pixels around on the screen. You just constantly go through that small batch loop to make the workflows and interactions that people are doing with your bank as quick and efficient, as easy as possible. I think about, especially in the upper parts of management, how can you get a vision that is a tool that can be used, not just something that kind of like creates this nice identity or aspiration that you have, but an actual tool that people can use. Now, you can decompose this down into principles and things like that, but really think about codifying those kind of principles, that kind of vision that you have. And that will help you scale because all of the people in the organization can look at that for guidance about how to do instead of having to ask about it and being told directly necessarily. So the other key thing, there's 2 key things that are really vital to figuring out how you scale. And that is, first, to start small and slower than you think you should. A lot of people, if they look at the thousands of applications that they have, they want to, over the course of the first year, a couple of years, each of the team is responsible for modernizing it. And that, for the most case, couldn't be a worse idea. Instead, what you want to do as you're learning a new way to operate, a new way of thinking, right? You're using new technologies to run your software on, you're going through that small batch loop at a weekly basis. This is all stuff that's going to be new to your organization and the people doing it. And so what you want to do is you want to apply that same learning loop, that same small batch loop, and start with 1 project for a month or 2. Start with 2 projects after that, scale it up to 5, and kind of go through that line over the course of the first year, where you are learning what works in your organization. You're learning to use this new meatware and software, this new way of doing things, and you're adapting a lot of these standard practices to fit exactly what you're doing. You're also building up a track record that you'll use, as I'll get into, to prove that this new way works when you're trying to scale it to the rest of your organization. Now, the other key thing to doing this is you identify some of the people in those initial projects, the product teams working on it, who are more people-centric, they're kind of outgoing. And you take those individuals, and as you go to new applications and start up new teams, you take these individuals and you seed them into these new teams to be someone who already knows how to do things in this new way. So they can help that team do a little bit better than bootstrapping from nothing. They can help train up that team, help build the trust that this new methodology is working, and then they train someone else. So now you've got 2 people who can be sent out into another seed team, and then 4 people, so forth and so on. So you're slowly but surely training these new people by starting small with some initial applications instead of doing everything at once, which generally won't work out because you won't have the chance to learn how to do it and adapt it to what works in your organization. And I see this time and time again, that organizations methodically start out smaller and they just sort of build up slowly by seeding people and spreading that knowledge through their organization. So the final thing that I want to cover is about midway through, when you've validated that this is a good methodology, you've gone through a couple of teams, the next thing that you're going to want to do is really brand what you're doing. Now that sounds kind of like a crass marketing thing, but you remember what I was saying is you want to adapt the kind of off-the-shelf methodology to what works in your organization. So you want to codify what that is, kind of write it up, and you want to really boil down that vision, that pragmatic vision, to a set of principles, how you operate. And you also want to come up with your own name for something, like you see at BT, British Telecom. They call this whole new way of doing things Canvas. It has the Tanzu application platform that runs on it, the Tanzu Kubernetes stuff that they use for it, and they kind of follow the Tanzu Labs way of doing product management. So they, instead of calling it all Tanzu stuff or calling it Agile or Lean product, they've come up with their own name for it, right? They own that, and they really have the sort of branding around it. And this comes up time and time again. You can see with Duke Energy and Daimler there, that it's very important that you own this new process, that it's not some other process that's an external thing. It's the one that's yours, right? And I see this over and over again. Another thing that's very important is to at least have one person that is full-time dedicated to being an advocate for it, a marketer for it. Now, initially what this person will do is they'll go visit lots of teams and kind of just do some educational and awareness driving about what this culture is like, how to use it, and really kind of help spread that word. They'll also get input. If you think about what they're doing, they're treating those developers, those product teams, as customers for this culture, right? So they're almost advocating for and helping product manage what that culture looks for. Now, after you get through a few initial teams, what this should turn into is about quarterly, as you, I don't know, maybe 5, 6 teams that you have 6 months or so into this, is you want to start having quarterly internal conferences. They can be online if they're about half a day, or if they're in person, they should be about a day long. And you have some of those initial teams that have been successful. They present at that conference about their experience. You do training at that conference about the platform that you're using, like the Tanzu platform or whatever you may be doing, about the small batch loop, the product mentality that you're doing. And you're using this quarterly cadence of an internal conference to build up awareness, to build up trust, because all the employees are talking to themselves. It's not just fancy pants outsiders like myself who have a bias to make you buy some VMware Tanzu stuff. But you're almost talking to yourself, and you're spreading and training this culture. And that begins to be a way that you can scale that out, right? And if you have recordings, it's easier to do this as well. So I like to go over this point because this is an amount of training and really marketing that I don't think most IT organizations think about for their software. It's not really just like a program office or center of excellence. It's almost the reverse of where these people are going out into the field, if you will, and really working with those teams and really putting together you don't get a lot of presentations from the center of excellence. Instead, you get presentations from the teams themselves and the culture, and they're trying to take ownership and really drive spreading that culture around. So that's just a sampling of, I think, some of the most important things when it comes to scaling culture. There's all sorts of other things if you want to go read the 2 books that I have. But I wanted to try to fill in some of those things between, the simple circles of an owl and actually getting to that final thing. You can see my personal example of the metaphor here. I've tried to show how you go between the circles and the owl. I mean, I think that's pretty good. I'm always trying to improve. I'm a risk taker. But hopefully you've gotten an idea of what that culture looks like when people talk about culture, when they're trying to use software as that primary way that they're doing business. And you've got an inkling of the system you need to set up, the attributes that the team has, the attributes that management needs to put into their system. And also a little bit, if you're in a large organization, or really any size, but especially a large organization, how you can scale that out, how you can be successful enterprise-wide instead of it just being the lucky few teams who are doing it. And with that, thank you.